Amen. Thank you, worship team. It is time to focus on the Word of God for a little bit. We're going to start out today with a story about my buddy Lawrence. Now, this story happened a while ago, all the way back in 58. Does that seem like a long time ago to you? Yeah, but we're not talking about 1958. We're talking about the year 258. All right, my buddy Lawrence in 258. So here we go. So when I was about 20, I guess I was 21 years old, I took a tour of Europe. I went backpacking in Europe with my friends. Anybody done that before? Amazing experience. I went to Rome twice because I just couldn't get enough of it. I am a super history buff. And while I was in Rome, I was in the Roman Forum. Amazing place. And I was taking a guided tour, and we were in front of one of these huge basilicas. That's like a Roman, sometimes they were temples, sometimes they were Senate buildings. This one had been a temple at one point, a temple where they worshiped all pagan gods, pagan Roman gods, and sacrificed to them, all kinds of stuff there. And then later on, it had become a very large and famous church. And the tour guide was telling us about how that transition had happened, how it had gone from being a pagan temple to a very large and important Roman church. And the answer was my buddy Lawrence. So here's how it goes. I'm going to tell this story, St. Lawrence, you can look him up later. I'm going to tell this story as if he were somebody a little bit more modern so that we can kind of relate to it in the best way that we can. All right, so Lawrence, he grew up in Spain. He became a Christian when he was a teenager. He and his best friend actually became Christians about the same time, and then they were called to become pastors. They called them priests back then, but pretty much they were like pastors are today. They were called to become pastors. They entered the church. They were teaching people about Jesus, trying to get more people to come to church, get more people to follow God, do the right thing, trying to help anybody who they could, help the poor, help those who are in need. As time went on, over a period of about 10, 15 years, they led larger and larger churches. And eventually, Lawrence's best friend was called by the church in Rome to become their lead pastor or bishop. So Lawrence's best friend became the bishop of the city of Rome, huge important city, of course. And so Lawrence became one of the deacons of Rome. Now, there were 7 deacons of Rome, and what it meant to be a deacon was you were sort of like a ministry leader, right? So the pastors, they would go around, and pray for people and run church times of worship, and they would help lead and make decisions. And the deacons, they would run all the ministries of the church. So if you think about our church, for example, right now we're doing all kinds of things, right? People come to us with needs, and we help them. We reach out to people by doing events like Summer Fun at the Park that's happening on Friday. You should come to Summer Fun at the Park. It's going to be so much fun. That's run, we don't actually call them deacons here, but that's run by a person who's a ministry team leader. Our youth ministry, our children's ministry, the person who leads all the stuff that has to happen at the building, Russell, who runs our tech ministry, who's running the live stream right now. Those are all kind of our ministry team leaders. That's like the deacons in Rome. So Lawrence was a deacon, and the ministry that he was running actually was huge because at that time, the government didn't provide any services for the people. So you can imagine major city, there's all kinds of poor people, people who have sicknesses, people who can't walk, people who are blind, beggars on the street, and no one is helping them. So the church had gotten together and said, you know what? Nobody's helping these people. We need to be helping them. And over a number of generations, that ministry had become huge. So people had given tons of money to that ministry so that there would be something helping the people who were poor. So Lawrence was leading this ministry that probably had tens or maybe hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money at its disposal. And he was administering that to hire staff, to help the poor, and to give money, and to do feeding programs, and help people find jobs, all that kind of stuff. And then the Emperor Valerian, who was that's like the prime minister, but even more powerful, right? Actually, way more powerful. He could do anything he wanted. And that emperor decided that the church had become too powerful. So imagine this. Try to put yourself in that situation. Imagine what this was like. right? So these church leaders, I mean, it's a bigger church than ours because it encompassed the whole city, but it's very similar to our experience of church, actually. Different culture. But all of a sudden, the emperor, like the prime minister and the government, decides that all the pastors and the deacons are going to be executed. So he starts rounding people up, and the first person he rounds up is the lead pastor, right? So like me in our church, but this was the Bishop of Rome, Lawrence's best friend, and executes him. He finds him while he's actually leading worship, takes him from there, they chop his head off. And then they execute all the other 6 deacons. Okay, so all the pastors and all the other deacons have been killed, and Lawrence is the last one left alive. He's the last one. And the army comes to his house, or maybe to his place of work. I'm not exactly sure where. And they say, come on out here, we're going to kill you, but first, Lawrence, we want you to bring all the money that your church has. Bring all the gold, all the silver, everything, all this money that you were going to use the poor. Bring it to us. We're taking it right now. Now, what would you do if you were in Lawrence's position? There's massive evil coming against you. How can you resist it? How are you going to oppose that evil? I'll tell you one of the things that Lawrence could have done, and his friends could have done in those days. You see, the church had become quite powerful, or at least there were lots and lots of people who had become Christians. And in fact, even at that time, a large portion of the Roman army were Christians, followers of Jesus. Here's something that those leaders could have done. They could have said, this is wrong, what our leaders are asking us to do. The emperor is trying to kill everyone. So we're going to tell our followers, right? All the Christians, we're going to tell them, rise up and fight. If they had told them to do that, they would have done it. There would have been a civil war in Rome, and the church might have won. Who knows? But that is not at all what those leaders did, even though they had the ability. See, Lawrence and his friends thought, you know what? We have a really good example of how to resist evil. That example is this guy named Jesus Christ. We follow him. And when evil came against him, he resisted it in a particular way by faith in God. By resisting but not fighting directly against that evil. It's going to be the topic of our message today. Okay, so here's what Lawrence did. It's hilarious. Okay? So Lawrence walks out. He walks out to the army that's there to kill him, and he says, okay, I give up. I give up, guys. You know what? You can kill me. That's all good. I know that's what's been ordered. But you know what? You asked me to bring you all the money of the church, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to bring you all the wealth that the church possesses. But you got to give me 3 days. It's going to take me a little bit of time. We got a lot of wealth. So he convinces the emperor, okay? And the emperor's like, all right, you got 3 days. Bring me all that wealth, and maybe we won't even kill you. You know, you bring me all that wealth, maybe you can even live. So Lawrence goes away, and he gathers all the money that the church possesses. We're talking about, in today's money, maybe tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. And then here's what he does. He walks outside his church. He starts finding people who are poor, people who have diseases, who are blind, who can't walk, they're crippled. And he just starts handing out money to poor people. Hey, here, you're a homeless guy on the side of the street. Here's $10,000. A person who's been crippled their whole life and you can never be fixed. Here's $100,000. He just starts handing out money. Imagine what happens as he does that. More and more people start coming to him, right? Pretty soon he is mobbed with people, and he's given it for 3 days. He's giving away all the money the church possesses until he gives it all away. Tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, he just gives it away. And then he picks out a few people. He picks out a small crowd of poor people. People who have sicknesses, diseases, people who are the worst in the society, people that are looked down on. And he says, come with me. After 3 days, he presents himself to the emperor, and he says, here I am. The emperor says, did you bring all the wealth of the church? And Lawrence says, yes, I did. Here they are. Here's all the wealth that the church possesses. This person who can't walk. This person who's blind. This person who's been in need, their experience growing up was awful. They were abused. This person is part of the wealth of the church. The church is wealthier than you will ever be, Emperor. Here, I present them to you. The emperor, let's just say his response is he was very, very angry at what Lawrence had done. He had lost hundreds of millions of dollars. He'd been humiliated. And so in front of this pagan temple, it was summertime at the time. Actually, it's almost the anniversary of his death. He died on August 10th. Yeah, spoiler alert, he's going to die. He died on August 10th, 258. The emperor said that the Romans like to have barbecues in the summer, just like we do. And the emperor, who is a very gruesome, evil guy, said, we're going to have a barbecue right now. And he pulled out a very large barbecue, and he roasted Lawrence alive. And this was right in front of this place that would eventually be known as the Church of St. Lawrence and become this massive church. That's how it changed from this Roman pagan temple into this amazing church. But here's the most hilarious part of Lawrence's story. Even as he's dying, he's being roasted to death slowly over a barbecue. And he's praising God, like many, many people who've gone through that experience, being killed because they followed Jesus. They have praised God even as they're dying. And Lawrence looks up at the officer, the Roman soldier who is barbecuing him to death. And he says this. He says, could you turn me over? Because I'm actually done on this side. Could you imagine? He cracks a joke even as he's dying. Lawrence gives us an amazing example of how to resist evil. Our message today, we're in this series, Not Home Yet. We're talking about how this world is not our ultimate home. It will never fulfill us. Lawrence knew that deeply. That's why he could walk by faith into his own death. He knew there was another home waiting for him. In this series of messages, we're looking at the books of Daniel and the book of 1st and 2nd Peter. And we are gaining lots of wisdom from these two guys who lived their whole lives waiting for something that they never quite saw in this life, but walking through all the trials of this life by faith. Today's message is titled, The Resistance. How are followers of Jesus, how are Christians called to resist evil? So let me ask you two questions just to keep in mind as we go through. We'll be looking at Daniel chapter 11, which is some crazy detailed prophecy that an angel gives to Daniel. As you go through that, I want you to keep these two questions in mind. The first one is this. Is the world getting better or worse? What do you think? Is the world getting better or is the world getting worse? It is maybe a bit of a trick question because there's no easy answer to that question, actually. Some people earlier, most of the people who were at our outside worship said, oh, it's getting worse. A couple, I don't know if anybody said it's getting better. I said it's getting better, but I also said it's getting worse. And then one person said, it's just the same. Interesting. Is the world getting better or worse? Second question that I want you to keep in mind as we go through Daniel chapter 11 is this. How can human beings resist evil without becoming evil? How can we resist evil without actually participating in evil? This is a very common theme throughout history and in movies all the time. You'll see this kind of a story, right? Somebody starts out with a good intention. They're going to change something for the better, but they're willing to do anything to make it happen. They feel like they have to use anger or violence or control to make it happen, and they end up becoming the bad guy. They end up doing great evil when they set out to resist evil, but they use the ways of evil to do it. So is there a solution? How can we resist evil without participating in it? Our message today and Daniel chapter 11 is going to answer that question for us. All right, so let's go into Daniel 11, and this is going to get deep. We're not going to read the entire chapter. We are going to read some pieces from it. I'll give you kind of a sense of it. I do encourage you to read it when you're at home later on, but you're not going to, this chapter is a prophecy that for Daniel was stuff that's coming in the future. And it is a very detailed prophecy about wars between nations and kings and who would be emperor and all of this kind of stuff in the region that Daniel lived in the Middle East, in the 500 years before Christ. So to Daniel, this was all very important stuff. The details of this was important. It was all future to him. But to us, this is all ancient history, and actually, it's a history that we don't know very much about. Some of you might know a little bit of Roman history, maybe Greek history. We might know a little bit about the history. Some people who are really into it might know a little bit about the history of the Persian Empire. That's what we've been talking about in Daniel. This prophecy is a play-by-play, detailed prophecy about the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. Okay, I am proud of you if you've even ever heard of those two empires. So to Daniel and the Jewish people living at that time, these were very important prophecies. To us, they're quite obscure. So what we're going to pull out of these are similar points to what we've seen before, that God knows the future before it happens. What the rest of history is going to be like, these prophecies will give us a sense of that. We're also going to be talking about, again, the Antichrist. This is this prediction that happens again and again in the Bible that really bad people are coming. The future of the world is going to be wars, desolations, and then really bad people are coming. And in the very end of time, the worst person of all will come. Someone who will bring devastation and ruin to the whole world because he will deceive the whole world. And the only person who can defeat him is the Messiah, the Lord Jesus. And he will. So we're going to see some of that in this prophecy today. All right, let's read the beginning. I'll just point out a few places where we can see that this prophecy is a detailed prediction of what was then the future. We can trust the word of God. It's astonishing. So this angel that we talked about last week, who had told Daniel how highly favored he was, how even though things were going to get really bad in the world, God loved Daniel and wanted to be close to him. We saw last week that that's true for every single person. If you're wondering right now, where is God in my life? God is very close to you, even if you don't feel him. He's just waiting for you to open the door and let him in further to your life. Let him in. It's kind of scary, yeah, but it's the best thing you could ever do. So this angel that has terrified Daniel, but also told him, God loves you, you're highly favored. This is what he says to Daniel. He says, now then, I tell you the truth. Here's what's going to happen next, Daniel. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, one who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Let's go back to the previous verses there. Excellent. So let me just point out a few things here. This first part of the prophecy is about what would happen in the Persian Empire and then the rise of the Greek Empire, which we talked about a bunch of times. All right, so this is some history you might know if you're super into history, okay? Or if you watch a lot of war movies. Okay, here we go. So 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. So after Daniel's time, he's living under the king Cyrus, who's known as Cyrus the Great. After Cyrus, 3 more kings are going to arise, and then a 4th. And the 4th is important in the prophecy because he's going to be the richest king of the whole Persian Empire, the 4th one. And then he's also going to attack the kingdom of Greece. This king of Persia is going to try to invade Greece. He's going to invade Europe from the Middle East. Did this happen in history? Well, if you know your history, it did. Does anybody know the name of the Persian king? Wow, this is like you're on Jeopardy or something. Who is the Persian king that invaded Greece? Xerxes the First invaded Greece. And if you've seen the movie, which is actually very bloody and violent, the movie 300, that movie is about part of the story of the Persian king Xerxes the First invading Greece. And the Greeks are able to, over the course of a couple different battles, repel the Persian Empire. So this happens. This is prophesying it maybe about 150 years before it happens. So after that time, of course, another king arises in Greece, and we know that king, Alexander the Great. He is able then to, with his small army, go and destroy the Persian Empire and take over most of the known world at that time. But Alexander the Great, he's a mighty king who could do whatever he pleases. Next slide. You can see Alexander the Great, some specific details are said about his life here too, just like they have been in previous prophecies in the book of Daniel. Alexander the Great, his empire will not last. It will be parceled out to the four winds of heaven. Alexander the Great's empire, when he died while he was still in his 30s. He was very young. And his empire was split up into four pieces. And those four pieces of his empire continued for several hundred years after, but not as one, as four different empires. This prophecy predicts it. Next piece is that his empire would not go to his own descendants. Alexander the Great had no kids. His empire went to four different generals in his army. And that's what those different empires are named after. Those weird names of empires I gave you earlier are named after two of his generals. So you can see this prophecy predicts in detail things that are going to happen hundreds of years in the future in Daniel's time. This whole chapter is kind of an enigma, a mystery to many scholars, because some people have tried to say this chapter is so detailed that there's no way it could have been written before those events happened. It almost, except for the names, it almost reads like history. You're going to see in a minute it's going to get even more detailed. So some people have tried to say, well, it was written after those things happened, except there are particular things about this chapter that somebody writing 400 years later could not have mimicked. It's very clearly written by someone who lived in Babylon in the 500s BC. In fact, we know it was written by Daniel himself. And it predicts future history in detail. We've seen this again and again, but we got to keep coming back to it. This is amazing. This should show us and convict us that the Bible is true. It's all true. If it can predict the future like that, the hand of God is in it. All right, so what happens next is this long section. And we're not going to read it all. It's about all these battles between the king of the south and the king of the north. And the king of the south gets a big army, and then he goes down and he fights the king of the north, and then something happens and he can't quite conquer the king of the north. And then the king of the north comes to fight the king of the south, and he gets another bigger, even bigger army. And he thinks he's going to win, but then he doesn't. And it goes back and forth and back and forth for like 250 years. And the battles and details of the battles are predicted in about verse 5 through about verse 20 of this chapter. So we can page through those a little bit here. Here we have the king of the south, right? And then the king of the north is making an alliance here, move forward. We're not going to read through all this. You can check it out later. You can go. There are 16 between those two empires, the Seleucids, who are in the north, and the Ptolemies, who are in the south in Egypt. Between those two empires, during this period, there are 16 different kings. And in this chapter, details about 13 of those 16 kings are predicted. Precise details. There's different things about family members being, they try to marry off different people, and they try to control each other's kingdom by politics. And then there are moments where sickness and disease strikes. And then there are moments where they abandon their gods, and then they turn back to their gods. It goes back and forth and back and forth. What can we get out of this big mess of hundreds of years of wars back and forth, and things seem to get a little better, then they get worse. Then they get better, then they get worse. Just this, what we've been saying this whole time throughout this series. The Bible predicts that the rest of history is going to be like this. Wars and desolations will continue. That's one of our points for today. Wars and desolations will continue. Things right now, we're sitting in Canada, 2021. Things are actually getting a little bit better right now, I think. I think things are getting better right now. Restrictions are being lifted. There's less COVID. Yeah, there's worry about the Delta variant, whatever there is there, but there's not as much rioting in the United States as there was last year. Things are a little bit better than they were. We're on an upswing. Guess what? That upswing will last for a while, and then it will go back down. And then it will go back up. And then it will go back down. And people will fight for power, just like they did during those 200 years. This will continue throughout the rest of history. Human beings striving in all kinds of ways and not really accomplishing that much in the end. At the end of this period, the North and the South are two distinct kingdoms. They've fought, people have lived and died, and they haven't really accomplished all that much. This is the nature of history. Now, when we get to verse 21, things change a little bit. Here in verse 21, chapter 11, verse 21, we'll go there. It starts to talk about one particular king who would come. The king in the Seleucid Empire, the Greek king in the north, who we know his name now, looking back at history, and the book of Daniel has predicted his coming a few times. This king in history was known as Antiochus IV. Or Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means like the amazing, magnificent, manifest God. He called himself God. Yeah, he had a really small ego. Antiochus Epiphanes, in the book of Daniel, is this man who would come and bring, he was predicted to come and bring the abomination that causes desolation. He was this future figure for them who was coming, who would just be worse than anybody else they'd seen. And when he came, there was just all kinds of evil that was going to come on the Jewish nation. He was going to kill people, torture people, wreck the temple, tear it down, sacrifice pigs on the altar of the temple, which was against the Jewish law. He was just going to do the worst. And he was going to represent a kind of end. An end of one period of the Jewish nation's history and the beginning of a new period. But here's the weird thing about Daniel. We've noticed this a number of times. Not about Daniel himself, about the book. In the prophecies, it'll go through, we've seen this is the third time we've seen it now, in different chapters in Daniel. Happens in chapter 8, happens in chapter 9, happens in chapter 11. We'll have these prophecies that are very detailed about the coming of this one guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. And they'll follow his life almost exactly, point by point by point. And then there'll start to be things that couldn't possibly be about him. Things that could only happen at the end of the world. The time of the real end, when God will come and restore all things. It's like it shifts without even making a transition. They're talking about this one guy, this small Antichrist. And then all of a sudden they start talking about the big Antichrist. The angel starts. The Antichrist who will come at the very end. And that's exactly what we see here. It goes point by point through Antiochus Epiphanes' life, right? So it's talking about him here. He'll be succeeded by his predecessor, will be succeeded by a contemptible person. This is Antiochus, who has not been given the honor of royalty. Antiochus IV was not actually next in line for the throne. He gains the throne through manipulation and control, through politics. So we see here, he's going to gain the throne through intrigue, right here. He will seize it through intrigue. Then he builds a huge army, and he has a couple of victories. If we move down here into verse 30, I'll show you, there's a lot of points that follow his life exactly. I'll show you one of them in verse 30. Is that where it is? Nope. Western coastlands. Oh, I can't find it right now. Find me the verse about the western coastlands. Excellent. Okay, so Antiochus builds this big army and he goes down. He's the king of the north. He goes down to take out the king of the south. And he almost does it, just like many of his predecessors did. But he's actually opposed. It says in this verse that he runs away because the ships of the western coastlands turn him back. Well, what actually happens to Antiochus Epiphanes in history is that he's about to win against these guys who are the kings in Egypt that his ancestors have been fighting against for 250 years, but then the Romans show up. the ships of the western coastlands. Where is Italy compared to Greece and compared to the Seleucid Empire in Syria? It's way out west, way out in the ocean, in the coastlands. And the Roman Empire at that time was a rising power in the Mediterranean, and they showed up and they said, no way, you're not doing this. We've got an alliance with these guys down in Egypt. And it's this crazy story where this Roman general draws a line in the sand. This may be actually, I'm not sure, I'd have to look it up. This may be where our term line in the sand comes from. He walks around, he meets with Antiochus Epiphanes on a beach. He walks around him, draws a line in the sand, and he's got his navy out in the ocean. And he says, if you don't agree to go home with your army before you leave this circle, this line in the sand, before you cross it, if you won't agree to take your army home, we're going to destroy your entire navy. And Antiochus IV finally has to back down because he's got the forces on land, but he doesn't have enough force in the ocean, in the Mediterranean Sea, to defeat the Romans. So he goes back home all embarrassed and humiliated by the Romans. And we saw, Pastor Philip showed us back in chapter 7, a number of weeks ago, chapter 8, this is why Antiochus Epiphanes is so mad when he gets back to Jerusalem on his way home. And this is what starts off his massive persecution of the Jews. So again, we see this, Daniel 11, here's the point. It's following Antiochus Epiphanes' life point by point. And then, when we get to verse 36 and following, it goes beyond him. All of a sudden, the battles are way bigger. There are things that can't be explained by looking at the life of Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, in history. He's conquering the entire world in verses 36 to verse 40, or verse 45, the rest of chapter 11. And then in chapter 12, as we'll see in a number of weeks, the angel actually says that the only one who eventually defeats this guy is the Messiah coming back to reign on the earth. And that actually the prophecy now at the end has to do with the very end. The big A, Antichrist, who's coming at the end of time. Okay, so what can we gain out of this? We can gain the idea, which we've said a number of times, that the Bible predicts this weird sort of succession of antichrists. There's going to be an antichrist who comes at the very end. He's going to persecute, he's going to take over the world by deception. He's going to be super charismatic. He's going to trick people. Everybody, almost everyone's going to follow him. But he's going to be teaching people to go down the wrong path. But the whole world's going to follow, and he is going to bring massive devastation to the world. And the only one who can defeat him is God himself, and he will. But before that final Antichrist comes, there's going to be a whole bunch of other Antichrists. In fact, in the book of 1 John, we see in chapter 3, verse 18, it says there's going to be many Antichrists. In fact, even in John's time, many Antichrists have already come. And in Daniel and the book of Revelation, we see this progression. It's almost like they build up more and more antichrists and then a change in history. More and more antichrists and then a change. So what is an antichrist? It's someone in the Bible who's going to do great evil by tricking people, convincing them that he's good, but it's someone who's going to lead people away from God. And we have seen, both in ancient and modern history, many antichrists. Many. I mean, you could name some of them. Earlier outside, we named some of them, right? Like Hitler, very clearly an antichrist. He follows the exact pattern of Antiochus Epiphanes, persecuting the Jewish nation and deceiving entire nations to follow after him. Many people at the time of World War II thought that Hitler was the Antichrist because it looked like he was. Yet he was not. He did not conquer the whole world, only a large portion of it. And his time was not the time of the very end. You couldn't have known that then, but we know it now because we're past it. Well, so we can think about obvious ones like that, but there are many others as well. In fact, in 1 John, when John talks about the antichrists who have come, he's talking about just people who've come into individual churches and gotten a whole bunch of people on their side, but then led them away from God. So there's going to be antichrists who are like political rulers. There's going to be antichrists who are just people who maybe deceive, a dozen or 100 people. There's going to be all these different kinds of antichrists who are coming. All right, so that's our second point. Antichrists are coming. So far, all really good news, right? Wars and desolations will continue. Antichrists are coming. History is going to go up and down. Now, today's message is titled The Resistance. Let's look at verse 32. Daniel chapter 11, starting at verse 32. Bring that up again for me. Here we see the response of the people of God to the wars, the desolations, and the antichrists who would come. And this is very important because it's going to teach us how we need to respond. His armed forces, the Antichrist, will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. They're going to attack the people of God. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. They're going to do some really evil, awful things. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant. So he's going to flatter people. He's going to deceive people who say they're following God but aren't really following him with their whole hearts. But the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Next verse. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or be burned, or captured, or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join with them. We'll read the next couple of verses here too. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. So here the angel gives a vision for how the people of God are going to resist Antiochus IV. And it gives us a model for how we are called to resist the evil that's coming into the world. I asked you to be thinking about, how do you resist evil without becoming part of it? The people of God are called to resist by faith. And that's the key here. So let's bring, that's our last point that you can write down for today. The faithful will resist. The faithful will resist. The people of God will resist, not by violence, not by control, not by human power. The people of God will resist by trusting in God, by faith. What does that look like? It looks like our buddy Lawrence that we talked about at the beginning, right? Look how he resists. Lawrence resists not by raising up an army to fight the bad army. That's what we saw the king of the north and the south doing, fight you back. It's like two little kids, right? It's like you fighting with your brother, your sister when you were a kid. One of you fights, then you hit the other. You did something bad to me, so I hit you. Then you hit me back. Then pretty soon it just goes on forever. But we see something very different in the people of God. We see a resistance that doesn't include fighting. We see someone like Lawrence who gives no space to evil. He will not give in to the emperor for one moment. He won't give him an inch. What does Lawrence do? He prays to God. God, show me the way to go. And God gives him this amazing idea, the way that he can overcome the evil power that's represented in that emperor. He gives him this idea that instead of just fighting back against the emperor, he's going to do something that will eventually cause the power of that emperor to just fade away. Eventually, through what Lawrence did, remember, he gives away all that money to the poor, and then he presents himself and allows the emperor to kill him. He won't give in to what the emperor is saying for one moment, but he uses that moment to teach many people. Remember what it said after that in Daniel? It said, the wise will instruct many. They'll resist evil. They won't try to fight it directly. They'll resist it. They won't give into it, and they will instruct people about the truth. And when they do that, they will actually, by God's power, be able to overcome evil without participating in it. This is the same thing that we see in Jesus himself. What did he do when evil came against him? He had taught people in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. He said, do not resist an evil person. Don't fight when evil comes against you. Just trust God. And then when it came to get him, when it came to kill him, he didn't fight. He didn't open his mouth. He didn't threaten anyone. He didn't try to get out of it. He just trusted God and walked right through it. And by doing so, he overcame death itself. He is our example. He is the way that the faithful are called to resist. Resist by trusting God. Resist by teaching the truth. And resist by prayer. Let's pray now, and we'll continue in worship.